All right, get ready everyone, because today we're diving headfirst into something pretty wild. The sneaky ways news can actually persuade us without us even realizing it. And you know what? Let's talk about the Iran nuclear situation. Remember all that back in the mid-2000s? I mean, global tension was off the charts.
Oh, absolutely. That was a period where the world's diplomacy was truly put to the test, and obviously the news was absolutely everywhere back then.
Totally. Everyone and their mother was trying to figure out if Iran was actually building a bomb.
Right.
Right. Well, we're taking a look at how CNN and Al-Jazeera English, those big names in news, were covering the whole thing. But here's the kicker. We're not just looking at what they reported, but how they reported it.
Exactly. This is where it gets really interesting. We're using what's called appraisal theory. Sounds complicated, but it's actually pretty simple. We analyze how those sneaky word choices can reveal hidden biases, trying to influence your opinion without you even knowing it.
Super sneaky, right? So picture this. It's 2005, 2006. The U.S. invasion of Iraq is still fresh in everyone's minds, and there's this giant question mark hanging over Iran.
Yeah, and just to add fuel to the fire, you've got the Bush administration calling Iran part of the axis of evil, right? So naturally the whole world's on edge. It honestly felt like one wrong step could send everything spiraling out of control.
Talk about a pressure cooker, right? And then you've got CNN and Al Jazeera English jumping right into this already tense situation. Now, I'm guessing most people already have some thoughts about these two news giants, don't they?
Oh, for sure. You've got CNN broadcasting from the U.S., often seen as, the voice of the West, especially internationally. And then there's Al Jazeera English, the newer kid on the block, broadcasting from Qatar, known for providing a different take on global issues, especially in the Middle East.
And that's where this research gets really interesting, right? It digs into how those different perspectives actually show up in the language they use to cover Iran's nuclear program. This isn't just about, just the facts, ma'am. This is about crafting a whole narrative.
It's about using words as tools to influence how people think.
Totally. So let's kick things off with Al Jazeera English. What kind of linguistic moves were they pulling?
Well, one of the things that really stood out was their use of what we call judgment words. They often portrayed Iran's actions as, well, strong, capable, even heroic when you consider all that international pressure they were facing.
So they weren't afraid to show Iran as a major power, like, hey, don't mess with us.
Oh, absolutely not. For instance, they consistently referred to Iran as, get this, the oil giant. It's like they were emphasizing Iran's economic power and global influence. The message seemed clear, right? To Al Jazeera English, standing up to the West wasn't necessarily a bad thing. It showed Iran's independence, their strength.
Interesting. But were they just blindly pro-Iranian government in everything they reported?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. See, while they showed Iran as this strong player on the world stage, Al Jazeera English wasn't afraid to call out some of their internal policies. As a matter of fact, they called President Ahmadinejad defiant, which, has a bit of a negative ring to it, even though it still kind of implies strength, right?
So it sounds like they weren't afraid to call it as they saw it, even when it came to a country basically in their own backyard.
Exactly. But here's the real kicker, and this shows just how powerful choosing certain words can be. Remember when Russia offered to host Iran's nuclear program to try and ease the tension? Well, Al Jazeera English used a very loaded term to describe that whole proposal: Western-backed.
Western-backed. Okay, I think I see where you're going with this.
Right. It subtly suggested that Russia was just doing the West's bidding, nothing more than a pawn. And that little phrase, it fueled anti-West sentiment and turned the whole thing into this big power struggle.
Whoa, talk about understanding the fine art of language. They were playing 4D chess while everyone else was stuck on checkers?
Exactly. And believe it or not, that's just one example.
Okay, so we've got Al Jazeera English focusing on Iranian strength and defiance. But what about CNN? With their totally different perspective, how do they frame those same events?
Well, let's just say their words painted a completely different picture.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What was their strategy?
So Al Jazeera English, they were all about those judgment words, right? But CNN, they went a different route. They preferred what we call appreciation language, often framing Iran's nuclear efforts not as a possible energy source or anything, but as inherently dangerous, something to be scared of.
Okay, so right off the bat, their word choices were setting a very different mood.
Exactly. For example, they used words like halt, stop, manage, all when talking about Iran's nuclear program.
Interesting. Yeah, those words definitely create this sense of urgency, like it's a runaway train or something, and someone needs to get control fast.
That's exactly the idea. They presented it as this looming threat that, the whole world needed to work together to contain. And to really drive that point home, they used a lot of, security language, positioning the U.S. as, the protector, the shield, keeping the free world safe from, you guessed it, dangerous Iran.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it, how just a few well-chosen words can totally shift the entire story. Do you have any specific examples of how CNN used language to really make people feel that fear, that anxiety about Iran's nuclear program?
Oh, tons. But one that really sticks out is how often they said regime instead of just government when talking about Iran.
Huh. That seems like such a small thing. What's the big difference?
You'd be surprised how much weight a single word can carry. Regime just has way more negative vibes than government. It makes you think of dictatorships, instability, like they just don't care about international rules.
So just by using regime, CNN was kind of subtly pushing this more negative image of Iran.
Exactly. And they do it so subtly. It's not like they're coming right out and saying, Iran's a dangerous dictatorship, watch out. But that connection, that thought, it's planted in the back of your mind just by them choosing that word.
Sneaky, sneaky. This is starting to feel like that part in The Matrix where they're talking about how the spoon isn't real.
I know what you mean. It really shows how the language that's used to describe something can totally change how we see it, how we experience it.
Okay, so we've got CNN and Al-Jazeera English, both using language in their own way to shape the story, to fit their own perspective, even if they weren't always super obvious about it. So what does that tell us about the news in general, even the stuff we think is reliable?
That's the million-dollar question, right? Here's the thing. Neither one was being totally objective in how they reported on this. They each had their own narrative they wanted to push, one that aligned with what they saw as their own interests. It's just that they used different strategies, different language tactics to get there. CNN went for fear, right? Making people feel like there's this threat looming over our heads. Al Jazeera English, they tapped into anger, this sense of hey, the West is wronging us.
So if big respected names like CNN and Al Jazeera English are using these sneaky little language tricks, what are we, the average news consumers, supposed to do? How do we even stand a chance of staying informed and not being manipulated left and right?
That is the question, isn't it? And it's a question that's even more important now than ever, with news coming at us 24/7 from every direction. It's overwhelming.
Totally. It's not even enough anymore to just skim the headlines or even read a whole article. We have to be hyper aware of these sneaky ways they're using language to mess with our minds. But how? Where do we even start?
It all boils down to media literacy. Basically, learning how to read between the lines, questioning everything, and spotting these hidden persuasion tactics for what they really are. Someone trying to tell us what to think.
So it's not enough to just sit back and let the information wash over us. We've got to be actively thinking about it, questioning it.
Right.
Why are they telling me this? What are they really trying to say?
Exactly. And maybe the most important thing of all, be aware of your own biases. What do you already believe going in? We all have them, whether we admit it or not. And those biases, they can make us easy targets for these linguistic tricks if we're not super careful.
That's such an important point. We have to be just as aware of our own internal biases, the filters we see the world through, as we are of the external forces trying to shape our opinions.
Couldn't agree more. It's like that saying, don't believe everything you think.
Ooh, that's a good one. So to wrap it all up, when we're reading about complex, messy issues, especially stuff as politically charged as the whole Iran nuclear situation was back then, we got to put on our thinking caps. Ask ourselves, is this article trying to lead me down a specific path, or is it giving me the information I need to figure things out for myself?
Music to my ears. Don't just consume the information, take it apart. Think about who's giving it to you, why they might be presenting it that way, and what they might not be telling you.
Love it. A little healthy skepticism never hurt anyone. This has been seriously eye-opening. Thanks for nerding out with me on this. I feel like I've learned a whole new way to look at the news.
Happy to do it. Remember, knowledge is power, but only when you understand how it's being presented and what those hidden biases might be.
Words to live by. Until next time, everyone, keep asking those tough questions and dive deep. So, media literacy is key. Got it. But what's that look like in real life? How can we actually get better at spotting the BS and being more critical of the news we read?
Honestly, it all comes down to asking the right questions, start with the source. What's their history? Any obvious biases, then you got to dig a little deeper. Who are they quoting? Are they giving you the whole picture, different sides, different opinions, or are they just cherry-picking the stuff that fits their own narrative?
So we can't just be like passive sponges soaking it all up. We've got to actively think about it.
Right.
Question what we're reading and why they're telling us this stuff.
Exactly. And maybe even more important than all of that, you got to know your own biases. What are you bringing to the table? We all have biases, whether we know it or not, right? And those biases, they can make us easy targets for all these linguistic tricks.
That's a really good point. We've got to be just as aware of our own internal filters, the way we see the world, as we are of the people trying to influence how we think.
For sure. It's like they say, don't believe everything you think.
Right. So basically, when we're trying to wrap our heads around these complicated issues, especially stuff as politically charged as that whole Iran nuclear thing back in the day, we can't just switch our brains off. We got to ask ourselves, is this article trying to like spoon feed me a specific viewpoint, or is it giving me the tools to actually form my own opinion?
That's what I'm talking about. Don't just consume the information, break it down. Who's giving you this information? Why might they be presenting it that way? And what are they maybe leaving out?
Yes. A little healthy skepticism never hurts. Right. This has been seriously eye-opening. Thanks for breaking it all down with me. I feel like I've got a whole new perspective on how to approach the news now.
Anytime. Just remember, knowledge is power, but only when you understand how it's being given to you and what those hidden agendas might be.
Truth. Until next time, everyone, stay curious and keep asking those tough questions.